الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and good evening everyone, and welcome to another night of great figures in Islam. And today, inshallah, this evening we'll be presenting two great figures. The first one will be Fakhruddin ar-Razi, and after the break, inshallah, we'll present on Imam al-Nawawi. And they both lived around the same era, the 6th and 7th centuries after the Hijrah, or the 12th and the 13th century, according to the Gregorian calendar. We will do it, therefore, in chronological order. Imam or Fakhruddin Razi came before, so we'll start with him. While I'm doing the two lectures, I'd like you to not only consider the merits and the achievements of each of the scholars, but also try to take some mental notes of their similarities and their differences. There are some important contrasts that we can learn from both of them. So let's start with Fakhruddin ar-Razi. I need to warn you before that there are many Razis. He's only one of about 6 or 7 scholars with the surname, and quite a few of them are quite major in their own right. So today we are speaking about Fakhruddin ar-Razi, not the other ar-Razis. Fakhruddin ar-Razi is one of the most outstanding Islamic figures in theology, as well as exegesis, which is a tafsir of the Quran. His work was not limited to those two areas. In fact, his work extends to basically every form of science you can think of. In his biography, somebody said he didn't write about politics, but that's actually wrong. He did actually write about politics. So I would say I couldn't find anything that ar-Razi did not write about. So he did not stay out of any sciences. He traveled very widely in the areas that he was born and around where he lived, which I will talk about soon. And he often engaged in very heated debates with others, with other scholars and theologians especially. He had a extremely interesting character, disputatious character. He had intolerance for intellectual weakness, and that's frequently surfaced in his writings. But in spite of all that, he was a master at synthesizing information together in the effort of finding the truth, whatever the source might be. He held a number of theological positions. We call them metaphysical also, which became quite well known in philosophical studies, and that's mainly in the Western literature. As far as the Islamic literature, he is most famous for his tafsir. Not much is written currently in relation to his theology, but if you look at some of the Orientalists and some of the philosophers of modern time, they actually refer quite a bit to ar-Razi, which is quite interesting. His full name is Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Umar bin Hussein bin Ali al-Taymi al-Bakri al-Tabaristani al-Razi. So he's Persian, we know he's Persian, but in his name there is a word al-Bakri, which indicates also that he is actually got a lineage back to Abu Bakr. So he's actually an Arab. And some of his biographers noted that, but again, it's very hard to tell because some of this information could be just based on guesswork. But he is definitely from Tabaristan, but he is known by ar-Razi because he was born in the city of Ray, which is very close to modern-day Tehran, currently in Iran. He had a number of titles. One of them is Ibn al-Khatib, which is mean the son of the preacher or the speaker. Shaykh al-Islam, or the teacher of Islam. Sultan al-Mutakallimin, the Sultan of theologians. And an interesting one, he was also called Imam or Shaykh al-Mushakkikin, which means the Imam or teacher of doubters. And that title was given to him because he often doubted the ideas that he received and subjected them to a relentless scrutiny in order to arrive at certainty. He himself preferred Fakhruddin. Fakhruddin means the pride of religion. It's a title, so it's not his real name. And we know him as Fakhruddin ar-Razi. He is considered by many scholars as the reviver of Islam in the 6th century after al-Ghazali. I'm talking 6th century after Hijrah or 12th century Gregorian. After al-Ghazali, he was the revivalist without any doubt of the 5th century. On that, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there is a hadith that said that every 100 years there will be an important scholar that comes. That's why we come with these titles sometimes saying he's the reviver and he's the reviver and so on. So he was born in northern Persian city of Rai, which is located east of the present-day Tehran. The year that Razi was born was 1149. And just giving you some context in relation to the region where he was born, after 200 or 300 years of the Muslims being in that area, most of the region became Muslim. Before, they were not. They were Zoroastrian. And that was the religion of Persia. The full Islamization took place around the 8th and the 12th and the 10th century. Over time, the majority of people converted to Islam, but many aspects of the Persian civilization and culture was actually absorbed within Islam. So it's an important point to remember. So Islam was actually influenced to some extent by the Persian culture, and he is an evidence of how Islam was actually influenced by the Persian culture and the Greek culture. During his time, there was many issues in relation to politics. Although the area was under the Abbasi rule, it was sort of being governed independently, because the Abbasi during that time lost a lot of their central power, and the region became quite the whole Islamic world became like separate emirates or sultanates. So it was a period that was difficult politically. There was infighting among the rulers at the time, and the rulers were the Seljuks. Seljuks are Turks in origin, but they're Persian in nature. So they have both worlds. At the time, there was the news of the Crusades starting to filter to that region. The Crusades did not come into that area. They were mainly around the coast of the Mediterranean in the Levant, like Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. But the Muslims were hearing about it. But also the Mongols are starting to spread closer into the Muslim world. Baghdad hasn't fallen yet, but obviously the threats were there. So the Muslims were worried, and there was a sense of tension among the people. And that tension also was weighing in their conscience. So al-Razi lived in an era where the head state actually changed 8 times during his period. And the names of the rules are quite interesting. The first one was Ghayath ad-Dunya, Ghayath ad-Dunya wad-Din, and the last one was called Rukn ad-Dunya wad-Din. Rukn ad-Dunya wad-Din, I mean the corner of life and religion. And the first one is like the savior of, so they had quite interesting title. The Seljuks themselves were educated in the service of the Muslim courts. Some say as slaves, and others say as mercenaries. So you could say both of them are right, depending on where you come from, whether you call them slaves or mercenaries. In order to understand the achievement of al-Razi, it is useful also to present the intellectual landscape at the time, during his time. The Seljuks dynasty revived Islamic scholarship to a large extent, and they basically founded many universities, and they were also patrons of art and literature. The period was important, and we discussed it last week when we were talking about al-Ghazali, through the development by the famous prime minister of the Seljuk, Nizar-ud-Din, and the development of university in Baghdad. Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who's a contemporary Islamic scholar, says that the Seljuks supported Islamic theology, kalam, against attacks of the philosophers, and sought to strengthen Sunni orthodoxy through the establishment of the madrasa school system, which is closely associated with Nizam al-Mulk. So Nizam al-Mulk, as you recall from last week, set up the university, and al-Ghazali became the professor of the university in Baghdad. So al-Razi was greatly influenced by scholars who emerged during the period, including Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, who's the founder of the school of Ash'ari, and that we covered in our first lecture. Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni and Imam Hamid al-Ghazali also were great influences to him. In addition to that, also he was influenced by the tafsir of al-Zabkhashari, which is called al-Kashaf. And you can see some of that influence in his own tafsir, in his own exegesis of the Quran. So it was a time when also significant Muslim thinkers were actually alive during the era, including Ibn Rushd and Ibn al-Arabi. So you can see that was an era of, I wouldn't call it the golden age of Islam, but it's not far from it in terms of philosophy and in terms of theology. It was a quite active era, and there was a lot of things happening. But there were also many disputes. There were a lot of religious disputes among the various schools of theology and schools of jurisprudence also. In Ray itself, where al-Razi lived, there were three different groups living side by side. There were Shias, there were Shafi'is, and there were also Hanafis. And they often had debates with each other. That's in relation to jurisprudence. In relation to theology, it was even more messy. In the middle of the 9th century, the Mu'tazilites were all but kicked out of Baghdad. So where did they go? They didn't disappear completely. They went into that region. So there were a lot of Mu'tazilite scholars still living around where al-Razi was. But there was also groups like the Ismailis, who are called Batini, and I'll explain it, what Batini means in a second. And there was also the Karamiya followers, and there were the Hanbalis. So all of them, alhamdulillah, unlike today, they didn't actually fight and kill each other, but they had a lot of intellectual debates. And al-Razi was in the middle of all that. And he was an important figure in relation to that. Al-Batiniya, just to explain who they are, there are Muslim sects that interpreted religious texts according to a hidden meaning, exclusively on hidden meaning. They accepted, some of them accepted the external meanings, but the external meaning, they said that was what was revealed, and Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, what he said. But as far as the hidden meaning, only their Imam can interpret. The Ismailis still exist till today. They are a Shia sect, and they're not many in numbers, but they still exist around Iran and Syria, and I think headquarters is in London, in the UK. An important group of Ismailis is what the West call assassins. Actually, their Arabic name is Asasiyun, but there is a misconception that the assassin refers to Hashashin, which is people who take drugs. That is wrong. That is a misinterpretation of history. Asasiyun means the originals or the basics, like Salafis in a way, similar word. But somehow an Orientalist tried to explain why they were so militant in action, because they used to kill their opponents. So they were small in numbers, and the way they progressed is by anyone who was a threat to them, whether he was a politician, whether he's a scholar, they would kill him. And they used to go in the middle of the night, just like ninjas, basically. That's how they operated. So he wanted to study them, and then he figured out that, the word is close to Hashashin. They must have been on drugs when they were doing that. That is not true. That's far from true. They were not. They were actually very strict Muslims. So just a side point for you to know. So they existed, and in fact, they threatened the life of al-Razi, the assassins, because he took them on, and he took their theology on. He did not believe that the Quran should only be interpreted through hidden meanings, and only their Imam knows how to interpret it, which doesn't make sense. The other sect that existed at the time is all al-Karamiya. Al-Karamiya is the opposite of Batiniya. They were extremely literalist, and they were around for a long time. They were defenders of literal interpretation of scripture. They were anthropomorphism, which means they give God human type characteristics, which is again against the creed of Sunnah Islam. They believe, for example, a person can become a Muslim by simply declaring the Shahada, meaning by the tongue, just saying there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger, without believing it in their heart. So that's what the Karamiya is. They don't exist anymore, but they were quite active during the time, and al-Razi also took them on. And he managed to convert quite a lot of their followers into Sunni Islam, and the same with the Ismailiyah, he did the same thing. And that caused them a lot of problems. He was threatened by all of them, and he was also kicked out a few times out of cities where they had powers or villages. So let's talk about his family. His father is Diya-ud-Din Umar, and he was widely respected for his knowledge. As I mentioned, one of his titles is Ibn al-Khatib, and the Khatib is his father. He was the Imam of the mosque. That's why they call him Khatib. And there are reports that he has written 2 volumes on jurisprudence, Shafi'i jurisprudence, that is. A point to note here that al-Razi's father was a student of a scholar by the name of al-Baghawi, and who was a hadith scholar, who happened to be also a student of al-Ghazali. So there is a direct linkage in relation to the scholarship. Fakhruddin himself received his early learnings and knowledge and education directly from his father, and that was consisting mainly of what you expect, theology and Islamic jurisprudence. And like his father, he followed the Ash'ariyya theology, which is the quite common around that time. In legal matters, he considered himself to be a follower of the Shafi'i school of fiqh. So he was very similar to al-Ghazali in both theology and in terms of his madhab or jurisprudence. He had an immense love for knowledge, and he pursued knowledge everywhere he can, and he pursued knowledge in every branch of science that he can. After the death of his father, he traveled extensively seeking knowledge wherever he can find it, and he sought knowledge and education around where he was born, and in Khurasan. He even traveled to India, it's been said. So he learned about philosophy, aspect of sciences, medicine, mathematics, under the supervision of a number of scholars, including Kamal ad-Din al-Simani and Majd ad-Din al-Jili. And the name may not mean much to you, but these are quite important scholars in their own right. One of his statements about shows you how important was seeking knowledge for him, that he said, "By God, I regret the time I have spent eating instead of being in pursuit of learning, for time is precious." So that to come out from him is quite amazing, because he was like a polymath, an encyclopedia. So what more could he have learned is the question. In his late 20s, he visited Khawarizm and Transoxiana, and where he came in contact with the last theologian of the Mu'tazilites, which I was talking about before. Although in the beginning of his life he endured hardship and poverty, because being the son of a mosque imam is not really even those days, he didn't create that much wealth. But on returning to Ray a few years after that, he entered into the first of a series of patronage relationship with the rulers. And basically he was being sponsored by them and paid for them. And as a result of that, he amassed quite a considerable wealth. So he was a rich man. And he also had quite a lot of authority at the time. Let me talk about his personality, because it's quite an interesting personality. So from early age, he was attracted to study philosophy. And people who study philosophy have special characteristics about them, because if you study philosophy, you want to use it. And the way you use it is through argumentation. So he became very proficient in it. He was gifted with sharp intellect combined with powerful memory. And he was known as to be relentless in finding the truth. According to another scholar, al-Safadi, he's described in al-Razi. He said, al-Razi had an ability to express himself, a sound mind, boundless knowledge, prodigious memory, and had all of his proofs and examples at his commands. So this is a very quite important attribute and skills that helped him not only in writing, but also in debating, because he's not going to carry all his books with him when he's debating. So he had to maintain it in his head. However, he is also described as having bad temper and unable to control his emotions. And his bad temper made him criticize others quite strongly, not only in the intellectual way, sometimes in the personal way. And there are a number of stories about him being impatient with people making him wait and insulting them because they were late and not giving him the respect he deserved and so on. And there's also stories about him getting involved in an insult match with another scholar, which extended to family members. So I'm not going to go through those because they're not important for him, but they're quite funny, some of them, if you want time to go and read about it. You can imagine that from somebody with that kind of a...
Is it because he was intellectually intolerant of what?
Weakness, intellectual weakness. But these people were actually quite important scholars also. They were not... yeah. So his companions and opponents all agreed, however, that al-Razi had a great power with argument and reasoning. So even if they didn't like him, they still agreed that he was extremely skilled. But yet, we will see later that his critics, some of his critics, has described him as someone who is a master at posing a problem, but not solving it, and entering in a debate, but not in concluding it. So his nature is being seen by some who probably do not follow his logic as being never finishing anything, just starting something and making a big deal of it, but never ending it. So let's talk about his achievements, because that's what I'd like to focus on. His life is interesting, but I think his achievements are a lot more interesting. We discussed in the first week of the series about the emergence of theology in the Muslim world, and when we covered al-Ash'ari and al-Maturidi. Just a quick reminder why theology emerged in the Muslim world, because it actually offered another option for the deepening of spiritual and religious Islam. Some people needed that. Imagine that, because Muslims came out of Arabia and they spread, and a lot of people started entering into Islam. A lot of these people have access to materials like philosophy, whether it's Eastern, whether it's Greek. So they had quite good knowledge about areas like logic and reason. And you cannot apply the same rule in relation to faith and belief to everyone. Everybody is different. We are created differently. Some of us find blind faith quite easy and quite comfortable, but others like to reflect, like to contemplate, like to rationalize, and like to use their logic. That's why the whole field of theology in Kalam was developed. It wasn't developed because Muslims were losing their religion. It was actually developed to strengthen the religion. And al-Razi and al-Ghazali played critical roles in that. So for a long time, the stage of theological debate was occupied by two opposing schools. And guess what? It's still happening today. Until today, we have these issues under different names. One school basically said, you have to use logic, you have to use your mind, you have to use rationality, you have to use some methods to interpret and accept religious scripture. So that's one. The other school said, but during that time, that school said that logic and rationality is ahead of revelation. Okay, so keep that in mind. So that was back then. The other school was the Hanbali school, which said, no, you don't need any of that. You just need the literature, and you can interpret everything in a literalist way. So they argue that reason of no use to religious knowledge or moral choice. And they stress the absolute power of a mystique of the divine who could only be known as he chose to reveal himself through the Quran and the Hadith, nothing else. So you can't use reason, you can't use any of that to interpret it. In fact, they would say if you do that and you do it excessively, you are sort of straying away from the straight path. So what happened? The development of the two schools, Ash'ari and Maturidi, took place in the middle, basically. They took a line in the middle position between the rationalist and the literalist. And they argue whilst the religious truth can only be known through revelation, which is the Hanbali's point, reason may play a supporting role. So they gave reason a secondary role, but they still argued that it's still important in defending the truth and convincing others who may not accept revelation as being true. In moral matters, on the other hand, they believe that human action is governed by God's power, but human beings also acquire participation in it. Because Mu'tazilates and the philosopher says, actually, we have no power. We have lots of power, actually, they said. It's the Hanbalis that we had no power. They said that we have power, our power, that anything evils we do is our creation, any good that's done is created by God. The Hanbali said, no, you can't do anything. The Ash'arites came in the middle and says, we make choices and Allah makes it happen, basically. God makes it happen for us. So we play a role in that. That's in a simple sort of layman language. So by the time Ar-Razi appeared on the scene, the Ash'aris were still strong. However, the theology was becoming more philosophical. And that's due largely to al-Ghazzali, who we learned about last week. So al-Ghazzali, as you recall, started using logic and reasoning that was developed by the philosophers, not only to argue against them, but also he started becoming an integral part of the mainstream Sunni theology or kalam. This does not mean an acceptance or a reconciliation between philosophy and revelation. What it means is using philosophy to strengthen revelation. That's what they were doing. Ghazali, that's what he was doing. So it became more powerful in its condemnation of philosophical teachings. So al-Razi's skills in argumentation ensured that this continued. And he did use it quite a lot. And controversy followed him wherever he went because of his use of philosophy in terms of theological argumentation. So he went to Khurasan, to Bukhara, to Samarkand, and India. He made, as a result of that, few dangerous enemies, including among the group that I mentioned before. Which I said they threatened to kill him. So his enemies ranged from the Ismailiyas to the Hanbalis. And Ar-Razi settled finally in Herat, where he had a teaching madrasa built for him. He wrote a book about his debates, which he describes what he was doing and how he used to do it. His style was actually quite unique. What he used to do, if he's debating with someone, he would take their ideas and their philosophy and explain it in such a way that it looks very, very convincing. So he make it really great. And then in the last moment, he will attack it. He will have one or two that sort of spare refutations that he has on spare, and then he will bring it completely down. So why he does that? He does it to show how good he is in debating, and also to show that their whole ideas and philosophy, while it looks really good and really smart, if you take one of the bricks in the foundation, the whole thing collapses. And that was his style in both debating and writing. So he used logic quite a lot in terms of refuting the philosophical arguments, and especially the Mu'tazilite. Some of Ar-Razi's critics argue that, unlike al-Ghazali, Ar-Razi was more of a philosopher than a theologian. And they base their criticism on his early stages of his scholarly work, where he used to write quite a lot about other philosophies, and he even wrote about comparative religions in quite a lot of detail. He wrote about astronomy, he wrote about many things. But if you notice in his books, he always starts in his introduction basically saying that there is nothing like the belief in Islam and so on and so on, but now I'm going to explain what others believe in. And he would write chapters after chapters and explain it in sort of a natural way before he comes to the conclusion in the end. So his critic says, why is he doing this? He's like promoting those type of ideas. So that's what his critics were sort of complaining about. One of his biggest critics is actually Ibn Taymiyyah, and he's quite critical of that style that he used to follow. And so in addition to his debates, he had quite important philosophical writings also. He wrote a book, or a couple of books, where he criticized Ibn Sina, Kitab al-Isharat, Remarks and Admonitions. And he wrote another book called Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya, which he based on large part on Ibn Sina's work. So similar to al-Ghazali, he would summarize and explain Ibn Sina's ideas, and then he refutes them. But again, people did not read that into him sometimes. They thought he was promoting Ibn Sina, and they said he is under the influence of Ibn Sina, but he's not. So Hussein Nasr again observed that the theology of Imam Razi is marked by the integration of theological themes with other sciences. So that was one of the unique features that he introduced. He adds that Imam Razi combined theology with ethics in his book Asrar al-Tanzil, The Secret of Revelation, theology with Sufism in his book Lawami', and theology with philosophy in his most important work, which is Muhassal al-Afkar, which is his most famous book in relation to theology. It is described as his greatest work. However, many Muslims especially would argue that his greatest work is in fact Mafatih al-Ghaib, the key of the unknown, the keys of the unknown, which is popularly known as Tafsir al-Kabir, the great commentary, which I will discuss next. So his major theological works all begin with a section on metaphysics, explaining the ideas, and then he goes back and refutes them. That particular style of writing became most common with all later theologians. So if al-Juwayni and Ghazali were key figures in the development of Ash'ari theology, al-Razi is considered one of the most influential and colorful figures of this movement. He completed the integration of theology and philosophy that was initiated by al-Ghazali, and in relation to theology, al-Razi is considered the second Ghazali. So his position is extremely high. That is why he is being considered and he's being called the greatest Muslim theologians of all time. Let's talk about his Quranic exegesis, because this is also quite an important achievement. Before I talk about that, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes explaining what Quranic exegesis is about for some of us who probably don't remember or haven't heard some of the terms being used. So it's tafsir in Arabic. As we know, the Quran is the primary source of the Islamic religion. Therefore, it's essential, critically important for Muslims to understand its use and how we practice Islam. So we need to learn the Quran. We need to understand the Quran. Tafsir is the most common word used for Quranic exegesis. It is defined as the science by which the Quran is understood, its meaning explained, and its ruling derived. There are many tafsirs written. Very few, however, became classical tafsir books that people rely upon. In fact, there would be probably 10 or 11 that most people would refer to. The rest sit in libraries for scholars to refer to, or for curious people like some of my friends who just want to read something that nobody knows. So this is the tradition of tafsir, or the science of tafsir. So the Quranic tafsir exegesis fall mainly into two broad groups. The first group is called riwayah, which means narration, which is tafsir or interpretation via narration, and this is the traditional way of doing tafsir. The second group is called dirayah, which means reason-based or intellectual exegesis. The traditional one uses quite simple methodology. It uses the Quran first, so if they read something they don't understand, they look somewhere else in the Quran, maybe the same word exists, how was it used, and say, this means that. The second one is they look at the hadith of the Prophet, the narrations of the Prophet, to see if the Prophet actually interpreted that particular ayah, and they will use it. If they can't find those two, they'll go to the companions and see if the companions of the Prophet had anything to say about it. And in the end, they go to the tabi'een, who are the followers of the companions of the Prophet. But the traditional mufassir, they also used Jewish and Christian sources to explain certain things which they couldn't find an answer for. That's called Israeliyat. And that's used quite heavily in the tafsir of Ibn Abbas and Ibn Kathir and Tabari, for example. The second type of tafsir, which is where al-Razi was writing in, is the dirayah tafsir. This is not based totally on the transmission of knowledge of the predecessors, but it uses reason and it uses ijtihad, which is a scholarly research or struggle, if you want to go literal meaning. And al-Razi belongs to this group. This type of tafsir became necessary in the Muslim world as it confronted the new issues that they couldn't explain using the traditional method. It relies heavily on the Arabic language linguistics, and it relies only on pre-Islam Arabic, some of the poetry that was available, and it also relies on some of the sciences that were known at the time. So scholars would first look at a verse in the Quran and to interpret another verse. If they can't find it, they follow the same process. They go to the hadith of the Prophet, the narrations, or the companions. If they still can't find it, they use their own interpretation. And they use their own interpretation not based on mere opinion. They actually have a process that they follow, which they go through, and they put various possibilities based on language and based on other arguments. And in the end, they sometimes say, but in my opinion, this is the most accurate tafsir. That's why it's called by opinion. But it's not like reading something and say, I think this means that. No, it didn't work that way. They have to go through the process. Examples of that is al-Zamakhshari and also Fakhruddin ar-Razi. The examples of the traditional tafsir I mentioned before is Ibn Kathir, Ibn Abbas, and al-Tabari. You might also come across a term called ta'wil, which is different to tafsir. It's mentioned in the Quran in the same way as tafsir. As far as al-Razi is concerned, the two mean exactly the same thing. He did not accept that there were differences, but other scholars said there's a difference between ta'wil and tafsir. Tafsir is just stating the meaning of the words. Ta'wil is looking at the hidden meanings or something behind them. For him, he said, no, it's not like that. It's the same. Interpretation is interpretation. Let me just talk about now al-Razi's tafsir. So in his tafsir, al-Razi actually deals with many subjects apart from the actual Quran itself. So when he's quoting a particular verse and is trying to explain it, you might find that he's using science to explain a concept related to that particular ayah. Not directly, but indirectly. An example of that, there is a verse in the Quran that says that people who reflect on their sides. And he says, well, it says they're reflecting on their sides because when you are sleeping on your side, it's been proven medically and scientifically, you are a lot more aware and you are a lot more able to think clearly. But if you're sleeping on your back, you can't do that. So that's an example of one of his tafsirs. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah had a problem with that. He said that Tafsir al-Razi has everything except tafsir. So he's got science, he's got philosophy, he's got grammar, he's got balagh, bayan, which is the Arabic eloquence science and so on, but he left out tafsir. But I think Ibn Taymiyyah did not actually read the Ibn Razi's tafsir clearly, because it does have tafsir. And actually, in fact, Razi himself says that you might say that about me when he was writing it, that somebody might say that I am not writing a purely tafsir book. I am writing more than that. I'm trying to explain what the Quran is about. Some of these features, so he's commonly used the interpretation of the Quran in the light of the Quran, which is quite a traditional way. But what he does, he also tried to use something in Arabic called al-Muhakkamat wal-Mutashabihat, which is firm and ambiguous verses. He uses the occasions of revelation, which is also used in the tradition, asbab al-nuzul. He uses abrogations, al-nasakh, so he explained that this ayah has been sort of superseded and so on. Interestingly, he's got an idea about nasakh. He said nothing is abrogated in the Quran. What happened is the two are actually the same, but one is stressing the other. So he's saying that, for example, the word about the alcohol ban. The original verse says, don't pray while you're drunk, under the subject of alcohol, but then later it says you should not be drinking at all. He's saying the two actually reinforce each other, because if the purpose of us is to worship God, we're not able to worship God if we're drunk. That means that's even a bigger issue than not drinking at all. So that's the type of ideas he would say. So he also looked at the thematic unity between the verses and the passages of the Quran. So he is a pioneer in that area, and he looked at the interconnectedness of the verses. So if one verse said something and the other verse is a bit not very clear, and another verse says something else, and in the end, he look at what does it mean? The two verses, how do they connect together? So the meaning of the verse in the middle must be that. So he uses logic. And he uses a lot of scientific interpretation. In fact, his tafsir is being called a scientific tafsir. It's also being called a philosophical tafsir. He uses rational explanation to explain many miracles in the Quran. So he tries to explain miracle rationally, sometimes quite successfully, other times you sort of wonder. He used division and subdivision in his interpretation. So he explains, division and subdivision make his, because his tafsir is like encyclopedia, it makes it easier to read. So he starts with a chapter, then he breaks down the chapter into various points. He is critical of using Jewish and Christian sources, who avoided them. He said they were weak and they haven't been subjected to the same authenticity test as the hadith, so why use it? He was also critical of other school of thoughts who tried to restrict the interpretation to the Quran in the traditional way. So al-Razi employed certain tool to determine the reference of a text through which its meaning might be grasped. The tools were essentially linguistics, which is the traditional sciences, philosophy, theories. Whenever he needed to consider the literal meaning of a certain expression or explanation, he would refer to the other sciences. This allowed him to differentiate between the literal and the figurative meanings of the sentences. So At-Tafsir al-Kabir is considered his most important works. However, it's worth noting that some later scholars seem to agree that Fakhruddin ar-Razi did not finish the works himself. They say that he did not write it all himself. He wrote some of it, but his pupils wrote it. Now, there is no evidence whether this is true or not, but some say that he wrote it towards the end of his life, so he wouldn't have been able to finish it because it's quite a large volume. But there are some scholars who say that's not true. He's actually writing his tafsir throughout his life. He finished it before he died. There are many sides to al-Razi, as you can see. Imam al-Razi played an important role in bringing theology closer to sciences and even to Sufism, in which he added to his theological works. So he incorporated Sufism into theology, which is quite unique. There have been few Muslim theologians who have had a lot of knowledge of the mathematical and natural sciences as Imam Razi has. Another field that Imam Razi has excelled in, which is completely different to that, is medicine. And he wrote several books on health, pulse, and anatomy. And he also wrote a medical encyclopedia entitled al-Jami' al-Kabir, or al-Tibb al-Kabir. Al-Tibb means medicine, Jami' the collection of all the medicine, which he never completed, by the way. So that one is still to be finished. His most important work, however, was the commentary upon the Qanun of Ibn Sina, which he often criticized, basing himself on the opinions of other Muslim physicians, especially Muhammad Zakaria Razi, which I mentioned that there was another scholar. He was in fact, Fakhruddin ar-Razi was in fact famous in Herat for his ability to diagnose illnesses. So he was a doctor as well as a theologian and a philosopher and a exorcist. Imam Razi wrote several books on geometry, astronomy, agriculture, history, and comparative religion. Also of interest are his works on the historic sciences, and to which he devoted much attention. There remains among his writing treatises on astrology and other similar subjects. He also wrote on history of Muslim sciences. He wrote an encyclopedia on the history of Islamic sciences. The work that he has done offer good sources about names, definitions, scope, and major principle of the various Muslim sciences. He described the principle, scope, and major problems of each science. On the other hand, towards the end of his life, he became more inclined toward an aesthetic type life, Sufi type life. And he devoted his life to teaching, giving sermons and writing. Many scholars attended his classes. He had his own school that he was running. And he developed the reputation at that time of Shaykh al-Islam, the teacher of Islam. So in the last period of his life, al-Razi devoted himself to the study of Quran, principally. And this field of study, he declared it to be the most supreme of all, the supremacy of the Quran. And I'm going to quote from his will, which he's sort of summarizes his view towards the end of his life. He said, "I experienced the path of theology and the ways of philosophy. However, I found in them benefit that equates I have found in them no benefit that equates to the benefits found in the Quran. Literally, he said, if I translated word to word because it was written in Arabic, he said, nothing quenches the thirst or heals the sick like the Quran. Some argue that that's the point in time when he was starting to write his exegesis, because he seems to be more inclined toward the Quran. Al-Razi died at the age of 58, and he was buried in Herat in Iran. So that's Al-Razi for you, and we're going to take a 10 minutes break, and we'll come back and talk about a completely different scholar, Al-Nawawi, inshallah.